The first paper we are going to listen to today is by Nate Weston from Seattle Central College in the US. The paper is titled Targeting, Ghetto Labor and Mass Murder, Photos of Jewish Clothing as a Visual Chronicle of the Holocaust. Over to you, Nate. Thank you.
This photo was taken in 1938 of a Jewish clothing store. The exact location, day, and photographer are unknown. The anti-Semitic graffiti suggests that this act of desecration took place on the 9th or 10th of November during the Kristallnacht pogrom, when civilians led by the SA, the Nazi Party militia, launched mass destruction of Jewish businesses, cemeteries, homes, and synagogues across Germany and its annexed territories. At least 91 Jewish people were killed during the violence, and some 30,000 Jewish men were subsequently sent to concentration camps. The graffiti attempts to mock Jewish speech, asking, "Am I not a good German?" written incorrectly on purpose next to the Star of David. The attack, at least in this scene, does not result in the shattering of the window, as was the case for many other Jewish businesses, homes, and places of worship, but instead uses it as a canvas to speak against the integration of Jewish people into German society and culture. Perhaps the same phrase could have been, and maybe even was, scrawled on the windows of other kinds of shops owned by Jewish Germans, but it seems notable that this clothing store was targeted in this manner. These are fine, formal clothes, wearable by Jewish and non-Jewish Germans alike, epitomizing a shared culture which threatened those who espoused anti-Semitism and anti-assimilationism. As this example begins to point out, photographs of clothing represent instances of Nazi attitudes and actions toward Jewish people. This presentation will use a selection of images from the Yad Vashem digital archive to show how these photos provide crucial details that promise to widen viewers' understanding of the Holocaust, specifically dynamics underlying social segregation, forced labor, and genocide between 1933 and 1945. I'll dedicate part of this talk to the captured experiences illustrated in the images, focusing on the role of clothes as signifiers of Jewish people's lives across key junctures in this history. The boycott of Jewish businesses on the 1st of April 1933 by the SA demonstrates an important economic dimension to this early act of anti-Semitic exclusion in Germany. This photo from Heilbronn in southwest Germany is likely an extension of Nazi surveillance, as is the case for most of those in this presentation. None were taken accidentally, and they often appeared to reinforce or monitor the subordination of Jewish people. The sign held in front of the entrance is a phrase originally written by the German historian Heinrich von Scheitzke in 1879, "The Jews are our misfortune." Like the boycott itself, the sign, by referring to fortune, points to the economic underpinnings of Nazi anti-Semitism, as well as its roots, its earlier roots in the imperial era. A Jewish-owned clothing store was a visible marker of the important role played by Jewish people in German cultural and economic life that was seen as unacceptable to the racist The photo shows women's clothing starkly juxtaposed to the men in the street, suggesting a gendered aspect to this boycott, attempting to intimidate women shoppers, whether Jewish or non-Jewish Germans. Although the boycott had little immediate economic effect, the owner of this shop and his spouse, Hermann and Jenny Hertz, fled Germany for France in 1933 and ultimately again relocated to the United States in 1935. Jewish people's clothing businesses were among the earliest targets of Nazi anti-Semitic physical threats. Were the men in trench coats mere bystanders, or the most poorly disguised undercover policemen imaginable? It's impossible to know. They magnify the shop front as male-dominated space even more as they circulate menacingly before the women's clothing displays. Plunging ahead 5 years to the aftermath of Kristallnacht, when the Nazi regime was enormously emboldened in its efforts to crush Jewish people in Germany and its annexed territories. This photo shows a Jewish-owned women's clothing store in Magdeburg in central Germany. It illustrates the results of the November 1938 pogrom. In addition to the shattered windows, the clothing has been removed, likely plundered, demonstrating that the economic aspects of anti-Semitism had turned to direct acts of pillage over time. A photo from the recently annexed Austrian capital of Vienna shows the looting of a Jewish-owned clothing store as it took place during Kristallnacht, rather than after the fact. The takeover of Jewish businesses rapidly increased after 1938, and this naturally included clothing stores. On the 12th of November 1938, merely 2 days after the pogrom, Hermann Göring, the Nazi leader then in charge of economic policy, issued the Decree on the Exclusion of Jews from German Economic Life, which banned Jewish ownership of stores altogether. This photo from Frankfurt in Western Germany depicts the process of Aryanization, the non-Jewish takeover of Jewish German businesses. The sign states that the rubber goods store is owned by Stamm and Wassermann, but had formerly been owned by Weil. It is interesting that the name was retained, reminding customers of the original owner as if a form of assurance to them, despite the change. When the Second World War broke out, Nazi Germany won speedy victories over Poland and most Western European countries. In this photo from Belgium, German occupation policy required that Jewish businesses, such as this clothing store, be identified. The sign stating Jewish business is written in German, Flemish, and French, rendering it legible for members of each group. The requirement that Jewish people wear the Star of David on their clothing originated in Poland in December 1939, following the German occupation in September. Poland also saw the first ghettos. Among these were Łódź, established in April 1940, and Warsaw in November 1940. Both ghettos subsequently became sites of clothing production. This photo shows a clothing factory inside the Łódź ghetto with male and female Jewish workers wearing the Star of David as they toiled. The man on the far left gazes back at the camera, which appears to supervise these people's labor, and the scene depicts a spirit of industriousness from February 1941, despite obvious constraints. In the upper left corner, this picture lists the Jewish Production Company, a conglomerate of Jewish workshops in Warsaw that supplied Polish companies as well as the German military. On the bottom left, it says seamster, describing the type of labor the man is performing. The photo, along with several others, was mounted on cardboard, but never put together as an album. This man wears a Star of David in a different style as an armband, perhaps fashioned by himself. He carries a sense of dignity as the camera surveils his toil, and his clothing presents an intriguing style in the face of the economic, cultural, and military degradation of his country and his people. Working for the Jewish Production Company was far more humane than other factories in Warsaw at the time. At this point, Jewish clothing production created in a ghetto was deemed worthy enough to put on display and photograph. This photo was taken by Walter Gennewein, the Nazi finance head of the Łódź Ghetto administration. This gaze is that of the Nazi eye, intent on economic exploitation, checking to see if the products live up to his standards and promise profit. The photographer took some 400 total shots, although not all of them seemed to deal with economic matters. Clothing was also sold on the street in the ghetto. This photo gives a fascinating impression of life in Łódź, although it is impossible to know who took it and why. The two children acknowledge the camera and one even smiles, while the men appear to be on the lookout, peering in different directions. The photographer and exact date are unknown. Stars of David are visible on 3 out of 5 of these people. Here's a photo of a clothing warehouse taken by Mendel Grossman, a Jewish man, well known for his photography of the Łódź Ghetto, where he documented daily life. The woman has a natural look as she works, seated, rather than the appearance of being under a direct threat. Her Star of David is the style that originated in Germany in September 1941, yellow with the word Juda written inside. It is possible that the woman was deported from somewhere in Germany to the Łódź Ghetto. Grossman hid the negatives of his photos before his deportation, and several were later rediscovered. He perished while on a death march, shot to death with his camera apparently still in his hand, on the 30th of April 1945, the day Hitler committed suicide. These photos depict Jewish men in the Soviet Union sewing the Star of David onto their clothing. The style of the star is different than those previously seen here. The camera looks as if it is making sure that they accomplished the task. With the June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, the systematic mass murder of Jewish people began. Massacres and mass gassings often included the disrobing of victims beforehand. This photo comes from the days following the massacre at Babi Yar outside of Kyiv, Ukraine in late September 1941, that involved the killing of more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, children, and elderly people. The police here rummaged through the victims' clothing, showing that the event was an act of mass murder on the one hand and plunder on the other hand, still underscoring the economic aspect to the Holocaust and the steps leading up to it. These and several other photos of the aftermath of the massacre were taken by Johannes Helle, a German military photographer. Certain photos in this series were later used as evidence in war crimes trials. The close-up shots, such as this one, suggest that the photos were accounting the loot accumulated by the conquerors. A wallet is tucked among the clothing, surely searched by the perpetrators. This 1944 photo from the Auschwitz album was shot and collected by a member of the SS, the Nazi security organization tasked with implementing the Holocaust. He had been designated to fingerprint and ID inmates. Here, Jewish prisoners sort through victims' clothing. Clothing and other confiscated items were either used at Auschwitz in southern Poland, sent to other camps, or shipped to Germany. By the time the items were sorted, their original owners had been murdered. This photo from an Allied cameraman shows a pile of victims' clothing at Auschwitz after the liberation of the camp. As the camps were abandoned by the Germans, they were neither willing nor able to manage the victims' clothing they had gathered. There are numerous Allied photos from different camps of such piles of clothes. The Allies photographed everything that could be used as evidence in the war crimes trials. This photograph of piles of clothing comes from Majdanek, just outside of Lublin in southeast Poland. It operated as a dual concentration and death camp until it was liberated by the Soviet Red Army in July 1944. This photo was taken at Ebensee, a subcamp of the Mauthausen concentration camp near Linz, Austria. Obtaining usable clothing was important for survivors as part of gaining back basic necessities in general. Here's a photo of victims' clothing from Dachau, just outside of Munich in southwest Germany. It was the earliest Nazi concentration camp, established in 1933, and was one of the last camps in operation in 1945. This photo of survivors at the Bergen-Belsen camp in northern Germany in April 1945 shows women attempting to find workable clothing for themselves, an act of putting their lives back together again. The woman in the bottom right carries a sense of stress and strain that speaks strongly of her experience. Examining photographs of Jewish clothing during the Nazi persecution and extermination helps expose important economic and cultural details about this era. Jewish people played vital roles as sellers and producers of clothing, and their shops were among the first to be targeted by the Nazi regime. Their labor proved useful for ghetto production of clothing, where workers also wore the Star of David as a clothing-based marker of social segregation. Clothing was also removed and plundered as part of the killing process. Photography allows us to witness several of the ways that Jewish clothing operated in Nazi Germany, but the camera also served as a tool of exploitation for the most part. Only one of the photos was known to be taken by a Jewish photographer, who himself ultimately fell prey to the German-led genocide. As long as it is viewed carefully and critically, photography produced by perpetrators' cameras can still be useful in understanding the Holocaust. Because it lets viewers see a captured moment in time, it is a powerful medium for representing the past. Coupled with a focus on Jewish clothing, photography presents perspectives on a visual plane that are not possible with other kinds of sources.